What would you guys say if someone was critical of the church in saying a thoughtful faith shouldn't be needed? The church should be looking after its own. And so, and maybe a less adversarial way to ask this question is just why is ATF needed? And if you have thoughts on why the church isn't able to provide that service, be interested. Jeralee, you're unmuted. Why don't you start, and then we'll go from there.
So my thought is it's needed because, and I mentioned this earlier when I talked about my son, because we generally, it's the rare ward where you can show up and raise your hand and talk about the difficulties, right? Because it's not in the correlated material. So that's why I think it's needed. Maybe someday the church will advance. There is some effort of transparency with the essays and things. Maybe we will get to a point where we can have open discussions. I know of a ward that I was in a couple years ago where some friends who were teaching gospel doctrine taught a lesson on the essays. They showed the little video clip from Elder Snow and the reasons why the church was putting them out, and they were released immediately as gospel doctrine teachers after that. So in some areas, we can't yet even discuss everything that's on the church website. So that's why I think it's needed. That's my personal thing. And then people just feel really alone. Sometimes people will come to the group and say, you know, I've been wrestling for 5 or 10 years and I've never had a real person I've been able to talk about this to. And I'm amazed that there's almost 3,000 people here that all get me, you know? So that's my take on it. I would love for church to be a place where we could talk and wrestle and explore. I think we all would love to see that. And in some areas, that may happen. And some people like Dan may be really gifted and able to bring up some interesting new ideas. But for the general population, most of us either don't have the language or don't feel that it's safe because of experiences where we've had, you know, where we've realized it's really not welcome. It's really not what most people want to hear or talk about. So that's my take.
Yeah.
Love it. Dan or Mark, do either of you want to add anything to what Jeralee said about why it's needed and maybe why the church isn't able to meet that need?
I think Jeralee's fine with me.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I always go to the church is the general. They have to give general guidance, and then there's the need for specific guidance, and there's there's general conferences, the general principles, and then there's always exceptions and individuals and people with their journeys. And so there's always going to need to be, you know, study groups or, you know, whatever it would be. You know, we're just now have this electronic age and we can have a big 3,000 person group, but everybody has sets of friends that they can talk over the deeper issues with. And so that's why it's always going to be needed. And it really shouldn't be the church's job to do it.
Why not you know, take care of its own sheep kind of thing? Why not the church's job, Dan?
Well, again, who are you going to talk to? The most recent member of the church or somebody who's studied the gospel for 40 or 50 years? I mean, they have to find that niche. And I believe that their niche is for probably the member of the church who's been in, you know, a year or two, is kind of, they don't want to go much deeper than that. And so there's other people like, you know, that just will starve to death, you know, or malnutrition, you know, if we have to talk about that over and over again. So
how about like some committee, general authority committee saying, let's create a support group for questioning Mormons, you know, let's have Sunday schools, you know, that are specially dedicated to people who are questioning. I'm sure you've heard people advance that idea before. Mark, you're shaking your head. I want to hear, I'm meaning this in a good spirit of just like, why is this more complex than people might think?
The church wants to control every aspect of your life. Let's be real about that. I mean, that is...
Oh, brother, I'll fight you on that.
I think that there is a strong element of the culture that wants to define your identity as Mormon, and anything that is not true to that identity as a Mormon is outside and apostate and on dangerous ground. And I don't think you can deny that there's a lot of our culture that's in that category, right? Now, a healthy organization allows for independent people to have independent discussions about the organization. And that independence is something that brings us into, you know, a better community. I don't see the church as the source of authority. I think the church is an institution, and I'd say something radical here, and that is, in the beginning, man created God after his own image. Father and Son created he them. The reality is that our definition of God is created by man. And the moment that we fix it and orthodoxize it, or make it orthodox, we have created a non-progressive gospel. And to us, we should be thinking about the idea that the gospel is progressive. We ought to be thinking about the idea that in order to be progressive, we need to have the emergence of all truth. And if all truth cannot be constrained by an orthodox organization, then we have to be willing and open and honest with each other. To me, I think that the church is profoundly dysfunctional as an organization in many ways, and I don't think we should deny that. But the healthy way to solve that is something called rigorous honesty. And rigorous honesty starts by allowing groups to be independently probing the church, what is true and what isn't true, without being ruthlessly critical. I mean, it's a tough process.
Right.
But I truly believe that rigorous honesty and independent thought is absolutely necessary.
Dan, did you have a different perspective or an additional perspective?
Well, I'll just fight anybody that makes a sweeping statement like the old church wants to control every aspect of your life. And I have a friend, it's kind of a funny line, but it's like, well, the church wants to at least control two things, your wallet and your genitals, and they're both below the belt. So, it's one of those kinds of things that, as a philosopher and stuff like that, no one gets away with a big statement like that. And I don't think it's true at all. I think that they want healthy people who are going to exercise their free agency, but, within an organization, you have to have boundaries and things, and here's the scriptures that we're going to use, and here's the topics that we're going to do. And I sense them wanting to let go more and more, but they haven't learned to solve how to do that.
Here's a softball for you, Dan, just really quickly. I remember Albert Peck talking about being called into church headquarters and being asked, I think by President Hinckley, but I'm not sure, who called you to this, as if a member of the church should wait to be called by a leader before they take action. What would be your response to somebody who might say, who called you to this? And from a faithful perspective, why you feel like this is okay for you to take initiative?
Well, I think both Jeralee and Mark, used the term of feeling called to stay within this community. And so it's just that same thing. I've I don't know what I could do to convey what it feels like inside my heart to know that this is where whatever this mortal probation is, whether it's one of many, and I'm out there on all sorts of possibilities with things like that. But in this one, I know this is the place for me, and part of that knowledge is, the way I interact and the way some people respond. And I think I'm not leading anybody into serious error or whatnot. And hopefully I'm just encouraging them to embrace the journey. And so I guess I'm called by God in whatever way I can say that without, sounding really exclusive and, all the things that come with God. I just feel it in my whole soul that I'm where I'm supposed to be doing the kind of work I'm supposed to do.
Love it.
Yep.
Love it.
Are there any recurring challenges that you are seeing with people when they're trying to stay? Are there things that you notice coming up again and again that are difficult for people in trying to stay? And maybe let's start with Jeralee on that.
Yeah, gosh, it just varies. One of the things we hear about a lot is challenges with local leadership. People, it's time to renew a temple recommend, or they've been issued a calling that maybe they're not completely comfortable with. How much do you share, My rule of thumb on that is people need to earn my trust before I share. So I'm in a ward currently where I have a bishop that I knew had a pretty good understanding about things. And so I'm able to be pretty honest and say, this is what I'm comfortable with and this is what I'm not comfortable with. And when we moved to this ward just a little under 2 years ago, we were pretty honest with him moving in because we had that level of trust. And it was the sweetest thing. The next morning he sent a text to my husband and I and said, we're so glad to have you here. We're so grateful to have you here. So making us feel like, you know, we were as valued and as welcomed as anyone would be, no matter where we were. And he has a really big heart. And that's an unusual thing. That's not something we experienced in our last ward. So that comes up a lot with people, you know, what do I, how do I know how much to say or how much not to say? Or, you know, kind of what do I do with that? That's a recurrent. Does that answer your question? Did I get to what you were, Mark and Dan might have some input on that.
Yeah, Mark, any additional insight on that? Recurring challenges you see with people trying to make it work, trying to stay long term?
At the risk of offending Dan again, I'd say, you know, the biggest challenge I think is going to church on Sundays. Because frankly, there are a lot of messages that we get, you know, that are, you know, we're the only true church and that we, they attitude about the world. It makes it very difficult to have a nuanced discussion. I mean, I remember, well, okay, so my Facebook after Obergefell, you know, the Supreme Court decision, was to show a picture of me at the Supreme Court steps celebrating because I was as happy as could be when the Supreme Court came up with the decision. Shortly after that, in High Priest Group, you know, the High Priest Group leader was trying to, you know, batten down the hatches and tell how the religious liberty was going to be, you know, affected by all this stuff. And I had to say, no, this is, you know, my condition for staying in the church is when I hear things that harm, you know, people, especially LGBT people, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to say no. And so I think it is very difficult for a lot of us to hear these messages being expressed over and over and over again, that the marriage is under attack, that LGBT people are the they that are outside of the church. And when we stand up and defend that position, and I liked your podcast last week, Margie and John, you know, that you have to kind of be selective of what you're going to say and when you're going to say it. But you need to say it sometimes. And when you do, it takes a phenomenal amount of courage and it takes a phenomenal amount of cost afterwards. Because the cost is, at that point in time, and the High Priest group leader stood at attention. He is an ex-military guy, and he gave me a 10-minute reprimand right in front of all the rest of the high priests about, you know, how I was on the wrong track. And you know something? He's still my friend, though. And I have mended bridges, and we've had great conversations, and we've been able to continue on in a dialogue, and we're working together now. I mean, it's hard, but it's worth the struggle, because this is as Eugene England says, this is the workshop where we can work through what the other side thinks. And by persevering together, I know that this brother and I have come to a middle ground where we can have a dialogue, and he can have compassion, and he's not having those negative influences because we both stood up and we engaged. And to me, that's what engaging constructively in Mormonism is all about. It's not about just being there and, you know, being quiet and suffering. It's either we're going to, you know, I think maybe you guys even said this, either you're going to do something about it, or you're going to accept it, or you're going to leave. And I choose to do something about it. And if somebody wants to throw me out, fine. That's fine too. But at this point in time, the cost of being silent in the face of you know, abuse or bad things said is too great. So I think that's the cost that everyone in the middle way, you know, has to live with. If you're going to engage, you need to engage. And that really means standing up for what is right at the right time and the right place, and to do so with as much love as you possibly can. And then afterwards, showing forth an increase of love, to quote, you know, 121. I think there's a way to do it, but it's hard. It's really, really hard.
Right. Yeah. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, well, certainly I do have some things that I would say that would nuance Mark differently, and that is one of the things is the hard part about going to church are the things that he talks about here. But I really want to bring up, you brought it up, Margie, towards the end of you guys' podcast, and that was the importance of the one-on-one. If somebody says something like that made you uncomfortable, you don't always have to say it in class. Now, I certainly have, and sometimes that's what you feel needed, but I don't think it would be a rare person who's doing it in order to be offensive. They just don't understand it. They haven't had the experience. They haven't had the people in their face-to-face relationships or something that taught them that not everybody sees things as crisply as they do. And so just that importance. So whether it's in the line while you're waiting for the buffet, at the ward dinner, or whatever it would be, find them in the hall, go to their house afterwards. Gene England is one of my heroes, and his daughter, Jody, told me he would fast. She says sometimes 1 or 2 days before he would then go knock on somebody's door. And he was trying to make sure, what have I contributed to this? What kind of, what's my accountability in this conflict or whatever? And so they would go to this person in the right spirit. And so that's part of the community. And then that translates it to church. And like Mark was saying, he and this fellow who, had the head-to-head in church are now in an understanding. So now they're going to be more careful because they've met me, and then they know how their words affected me. So that's one of the things. But I do think that the Jeralee and Mark have hit the main themes. Of course, history issues and all those things come up. And so when you asked the question, I wasn't sure.
Hey, Dan, you're getting robotic again. Sorry about that.
Okay, I'll
jump out and come right back in, and we'd love to have you. I'll read a couple. I'll read a couple listener comments while you're jumping out, and then you can finish. I'm sorry that keeps happening. Tiffany writes, I'm just going to check in with a few of our listeners. Tiffany writes, would love to have a Mormon Stories episode with just Mark. So Mark, I think it's long past time we did that, and I'm game. So Mark, your job is to get with Cody if he'll accept it and to get that on the schedule. Jeralee, you're nodding your head yes, but I think the same applies for you. So you be careful what you nod for.
You and I have talked about that, John, and I'm sure it's in my future if you're still interested. I just wanted to say really quickly that I'm kind of glad that Mark and Dan are showing different perspectives on things, because the three of us are actually very good friends. We love each other. We respect each other. We are having different lived experiences within life and Mormonism. And so, we have these kind of conversations where we can respectfully disagree or see things from a different perspective in thoughtful faith too. So I actually think it's an important thing that we're, showing everybody here that we can say, I see that differently, and it's okay, because I love you, Mark, and Mark loves Dan, and
they're
awesome.
That's right. You don't experience an emotional disconnect between
you
remain emotionally connected amidst differences. Very important.
Mark can write some of the most beautiful posts in A Thoughtful Faith, and people just crave when he writes things and he puts his heart and soul into it. And same thing with Dan. If Dan posts something or writes something, people just flock to him. And so, we've kind of all got different things that feed and support different people. And I think that's part of what makes our moderation team work so well. Mark and I are really different people, and we often see things a little differently, but we're always able to come together in the end with an understanding. And it's a beautiful friendship that we share, all of us together. So
it's evident.
Love it.
Love it.
Dan, you're back.
I'm back, and I've switched headsets. Am I any better at all?
Yeah, it just sometimes comes in. But
I get it too with my podcast sometimes as well. The one thing I want to say is I just spent a few days in the presence of Jana Reese, and as many people know, that survey she's done, she's slowly unfolding different things. And I want you to know, I was even encouraged years ago when the Pew Research thing says of the Mormons who were in the pew, there was still like 12 or 13% that kind of didn't believe everything. You know what I mean? They were, they didn't have the full on belief. Well, Jana, as she's done the four cohorts, she's got the greatest generation, and she's got the baby boomers, she's got Gen X and the millennials. It's getting to be like 30 to 50% of Mormons that are in the pews with you. These are not the ones that are just sitting sitting home. who have far more nuanced views. And so just any of this, like, oh, I can never speak up and not have anybody, kind of relate to what I'm saying, that is just no longer true. And you can say, well, my ward's the exception, but I'll tell you, one or two sentences and a couple of get to knows you with somebody, everyone's fascinating and everybody's in a wrestle. And so I just want to note that is absolutely my experience.
Such a great point, Dan. And I just had a situation in my last ward. I taught a woman for a couple of years. So I was going through my faith journey during that time. I had no idea she was going through her faith journey. Now I've moved out of the ward. I'm almost 2 years out, and someone connected us together. So we had lunch. So the whole time I was her visiting teacher, she was wrestling and struggling, and I was wrestling and struggling, and we didn't talk about it.
Yep.
We didn't have the opportunity to have the right kind of a conversation. So we never know. You're right, Dan.
Don't paint with a broad brush.
If we can learn to speak up in thoughtful ways, I don't ever want to derail a teacher or whatever, but to speak out in thoughtful ways and start a conversation maybe with something like, in my lived experience, it's hard for somebody to be offended by that, right? Or, the way I have experienced this, then I think I did that once in a Sunday school, and a couple days later, a neighbor knocked on my door and said, "Can we talk? I have a feeling you get me."
Totally. Yeah, one guy said something interesting when I'd first moved into a ward, and after a couple of times of encountering him, I just called him up, "Will you be my friend?" And it was like, I just, I sensed that he would have understood me, and then we became
awesome.
Still friends.
That's awesome.
Love it. Couple other comments from listeners. My buddy Rick writes, and this is high praise from Rick, "I'm glad these healthy minds chose to stay to help the church from within. Thank you for representing those of us who have left." So appreciate that. Charla writes, "Gospel doctrine right now is difficult, especially because of the Doctrine and Covenants conversation." So that's probably what some people are experiencing. Tim writes, "We can value the support some find in the church teachings that have profound positive impact on their lives, and those who have lived experiences, who have experienced the teachings and culture of the church having had horrendous impact on them." So Tim's trying to sort of say both and there.
And he clarifies, yeah.
And he clarifies for him, it's LGBTQ and women's issues that are causing him to struggle. Randy writes, "What Jeralee said, I want to join the Church of Jeralee of Latter-day Renshaw."
We voted her bishop of our ward many times.
Okay, so this goes to our next question. Maybe we'll start with Dan on this. And this is total speculation. Is staying in the LDS Church as an unorthodox person easier or harder in 2017 than in previous years?
I think a lot easier. Facebook and all the connections that you have and stuff like that. It's hard to shock anybody anymore that somebody's on a faith journey, I think.
And yet, aren't there lots of members that have still don't even know the essays exist, let alone haven't read them?
Sure. But they are there, and you can bring them up safely and, skillfully and all those sorts of things. So I think it's far, far easier. I don't know what my colleagues think.
Jeralee, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I got to represent my friends with LGBT kids. I think people with gay kids or experiencing the difficulty of having an LGBT family member wherever it is, I think for them it's harder because of the recent exclusion policy.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah,
I gotta be honest about that. That I don't know how everyone, or if everyone, can stay and find a safe space in Mormonism right now because of that. And it's huge for me. In fact, when I recently chatted with my bishop, I told him that policy is huge for me. I mean, that's really difficult for me. And he was able to share some of his own struggle with that too. So from that perspective, And I understand what Dan's saying, but from that perspective, I got to say, you know, for the friends that I know who have spent their whole lives serving in the church, you know, they're finding it much harder right now today because of that policy.
I really agree with that, Jeralee. I think for a literal believing member of the church, 2017 may be the hardest year I've ever seen. And the reason is because the church essays are out there. The reason is the church took a position on homosexuality that's not working, clearly not working, and they've called it revelation. And they've said that there are no homosexuals in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And those messages are really hard. I have a beautiful wife of 37, 38 years now. I think I better get it right. It's 38 years this month. And she's gone through a lot of health issues, and she's also gone through a lot of faith issues because of her health issues. But a miracle happened earlier this year without going into details. And we were going, we took a trip up the Mississippi River just a couple weeks ago, and she shared with me more angst about the church than I've ever heard in 38 years, about the idea that the policy really hurt her. You know, we have a gay daughter. I mean, it was something that, and we've never been able to talk about that because it's difficult to, you know, open that box. And I think it's much harder for a member of the church who wants to stay literal, who wants to stay, you know, hey, the prophet is always right, never fails us. You know, I think it's harder. I think it's easier to be a nuanced member today, absent the LGBT issue, but because of some opening up and because of groups like this. But for believing members, it's harder.
Let me just add one thing. Even a believing member, even one who supports the policy, I've talked with them, and in their deep heart of hearts, they admit that it doesn't feel right to them. And so as soon as the church corrects this, you know, and, you know, there's been enough behind the scenes stuff to know that this wasn't a united quorum sort of situation. I won't say anything more than that. But as soon as the church corrects this, the church is going to have zero problem with a whole bunch of people rejoicing the way they did with the blacks and stuff like that. So right now, I agree with you guys. The post November 2015, I can see it certainly hard in those areas. But I'll tell you, the more members of the church I meet, the more I know their hearts are good and they'll respond to the truth. And, you know, they just have to get past that, the authority of the prophet versus their own conscience. And just even having a conversation with them, I know starts them down that thinking of their own conscience path.
Love it. I also have to wonder, for those who identify as feminists, if actually it's harder in 2017 because of Kate Kelly's excommunication, because of the treatment of ordained women. I would imagine that for many intellectuals, it's easier, like you said, Dan, but maybe for certain groups like feminists and LGBT people and their allies, it might be harder.
Well, again, Margie and Jeralee should talk. I would say, on the other hand, much more ward council involvement, mission councils, training missionaries. So all those things, you know, are also there. And then clearly look at Jana's stuff as she starts to reveal it and things like that. The next generation of those who are staying, you know, they're finding their own reasons for staying. And just once you've had a voice and once you've been accepted in it, you know, if you're staying, you're going to be speaking up more. So in some ways, I think it's easier.
A couple of people have written in and they're weighing in on whether it's easier or harder. And Spencer says it seems that it would be harder now because the internet has blown the lid off the kettle. And now people have to suppress the doubts and act like everything's cool and that they're all on board with it all. And then Tim weighs in and says, post November 2015, so much harder. So just a couple comments.
Can I just give Spencer Ashby a shout out? He grew up across the street from me.
Oh,
Love you, Spencer.
That's great. So what are the most common issues that people discuss on the A Thoughtful Faith forum? Jeralee?
You know, the LGBT situation that we're in comes up often. I find that oftentimes people come to A Thoughtful Faith because their child came out to them as being gay, and it sent them on their journey or their path the same way it did my child came to me with all these questions and this deconstruction, and it kind of sent me seeking. And so that comes up a lot, and a lot of talk about the Book of Mormon, whether it's, you know, a literal translation. There's a lot of dialogue about that. You know, we hear a lot about, you know, it all hinges on the Book of Mormon, if it's true, if it's not true. So, but you know what, really, we have a broad variety of topics. I mean, we talk about polygamy, we talk about all kinds of stuff comes up there. So.
Yeah.
And obviously family dynamics, you know, how do I wrestle with the mixed faith, or, you know, doing this or that.
Right.
But one of the things that's just great is like, hey guys, I got assigned to give a talk on this subject. Who's got an angle that I can stand behind? You know, or same thing. How do I handle that obedience lesson that's in the, you know, in the manual this year?
Or I'm teaching a lesson in gospel doctrine this Sunday. Those are some of my favorite threads. And then everybody who's teaching or presenting on that jumps in, and you know, those are some really constructive, great things where people can support and help each other to be able to present things in a way that's a little more open or palatable for a lot of us. So yeah, those are some of my favorites. Mark may want to jump in here too.
Yeah, what do you think, Mark?
I think what I enjoy the most is when people come into the group and they're willing to share their stories. I think just hearing how the church has affected them, how the gospel affects them, how, you know, how they're making it work and what they're suffering through. You know, we get some people coming on and it's just amazing the kind of reaction that we get. We get people all, you know, just, it doesn't matter what a person says. They can be angsty, they can be frustrated. You know, I mean, if they're angry and they're making claims, like I said, that the church is, what did I say, Dan? I don't know. If I said, you know, and obviously there are some limits, but when people are sharing their true feelings and then saying, yeah, this is how I make it work. I mean, there's some pretty strong stories. And then, you know, what I appreciate the most is when people are just being honest with themselves and just finding their true selves in this thing. And it's the stories that make the difference to me. We have a poet in residence, or at least an eclectic in residence, Kim Pusey, and so many others that provide, I get so much out of so many posts by many different people. I mean, it's not the moderators that make a thoughtful faith. It's every member that contributes and brings their story. It's also a lot of people, and I've become more aware as people come to me in church, even in a work environment. I was just at a conference and a woman came up to me, a CEO of a company, and said, I know you. You're at a thoughtful faith. And I said, what's your name again? And I'd never heard of her. She is never posted, but she's there and she listens and she reads everything. And there are a lot of people in that category that are there to get that support. And I think it makes a difference. I really do. It's the contribution of the everyday person, the stories. You know, John, you know, you started Mormon Stories. It really is about the stories, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add, when we admit people to the group, we invite them to share an introduction. Not everybody's comfortable with that. If they express some discomfort, like, do I have to do that? Is that mandatory? I say, no, it's not mandatory. But, you know, if you do, you will be overwhelmed with the love and support you feel from the people in this group. And in the sharing of these stories, we find that no two are identical. But in the sharing of these stories, we find common threads that connect us to each other, you know?
Right.
And so kind of one of the unique things about our group is that we get to know a little bit about somebody right up front if they're willing to share. Sometimes people are in the group a long time and they're like, okay, now I'm finally ready, you know? But they're beautiful outpouring of support and love, and I get you, and I've experienced that. And people are just overwhelmed, often to tears, where they just can't believe that all these strangers are rallying around them. And it's a beautiful thing.
That is beautiful.
If somebody were to, let's just say a Bruce R. McConkie style Orthodox member was to say to you guys, listen, church is either true or false. You either, you know, the brethren speak for God. You either sign up to every covenant you make, and you are either all in, or we don't want you because you're a danger to those around you. So either get in line or, you know, get off the train. if someone were to sort of make that sort of comment to you as an Orthodox believer, Mark, we'll start with you on this. What would you say to that Orthodox member?
I presume that you're saying that that's not somebody that would come to ATF and say.
Yeah. They're just, in other words, the argument that we don't want liberals, it's not good for liberals to be in this church. You know, it's better off with them being gone. Either believe everything or get out, you know?
Great. Well, you know, that's a view. It's not a very good view, and I might remind them if they cited Bruce R. McConkie that Bruce after 1978 did happen to mention we spoke from limited knowledge. So I mean, I would remind that person that, you know, that white and black thinking is probably not the best answer. There isn't a good answer to somebody who is totally white and black. And sometimes it's just necessary to be polite and move on, because there's not really going to be a great conversation you're going to have with somebody who's that way. And you know what's really funny about that kind of thinking is when they eventually, and they will, find out that the church is not all white. You know, in other words, it's not all right and it's not all true, and they will invariably find that out. Then the only switch and alternative they have is it must then be all false. And that's the problem that I see in our communities today, in this community particularly, is because they come with that, the 40 years of Pollyannish, the church is true and the prophet can never lead us astray, and suddenly the November 2015 policy comes out. And you know, I hate to say that, hallelujah, for a policy, but to me, it's kind of like, you want rules, I'll give you 613 rules. That's what God did in the Old Testament, at least, you want policies, I'll give you policies, bad policies. You want to follow king men and you want to idolize human beings as being infallible, I'll give you people that are so narcissistic leading your church that they will say that that homosexuals can't be members of the church. I'm going to say that, you build into somebody the idea that they are somehow special and beyond anybody else, they're going to get that entitlement. And when bad policies come out, there's a natural thing that will happen. And that is those people who take that hard right or left line are going to have to struggle mightily with it. And maybe, just maybe, that's what God is doing to work with us, is to help us see our error when we are so arrogant in our certainty.
Love it. Dan, what would you say to this well-intended Orthodox member?
I'm with Mark. You don't engage them. No matter what happens in the church or in a group or with somebody else, my call is the same. Be compassionate, be myself, try to radiate, goodness, and see them that they got to that position and place in an honest way. I've had so many experiences from hanging out at church of somebody who bothered me, and then, I meet their parents or something like that. Like, oh, they came to that honestly, that particular thing, or for whatever reason. And I was allowed a faith journey. I'll let them allow their journey, but I definitely don't go toe to toe with them on something like that. It's just my life experience shows me this, and that'd be about the farthest that I would engage.
Jeralee, anything else? I mean, there is a scriptural argument for diversity, right?
Yeah, I find that especially on social media, I'm not going to change anybody's mind. So I try to approach those conversations by just saying, I spent a little over 50 years as a very black and white thinker. And I have found that being able to make that shift into leaving space and being open to the possibilities, it helps me, number one, to be able to accept the choices of all of my children, wherever they are. And I feel like I've gone from, we talk a lot about going from black and white belief to the gray, which isn't very attractive thought to me. Yeah. And so I love the idea of going to this full spectrum of color and possibilities where my heart and my mind are open to lots of possibilities. So I have things that I believe enough to, guide my life and that I use to direct my life. But I'm very open and trying to work on being open to the possibilities of lots of things. So I was once that very black and white thinker. And so when people talk like that, I can remind myself, I could have said that, a few years ago. That could have been me. And that actually helps me to be able to hold space for them, because I didn't expect this thing to appear in my path that totally changed so many things about the way I feel and think. It didn't change the way I live, but who knows what might come into somebody else's path, So I just love the idea of holding space for people and being open and accepting ambiguity. To me, that's a peaceful place.
Beautiful. I love that. Okay, this is for all of you. If there are favorite thinkers or leaders, I would add to that, if you have any sort of mentors, they can be alive or not, but people who've been formative to you, inspiring to you in your journeys.
And you could also do books or podcasts or essays, any of that stuff.
Let's start with Mark.
Sterling McMurrin.
Great.
He was able to say, angels don't, reveal books to the earth. He stayed Mormon. It wasn't very active. And they tried to kick him out of the church, but they couldn't find any witnesses against him to kick him out. And he certainly spoke from a position of privilege. There's no question about that. But I find in Sterling McMurrin the willingness to look at the church and say, I love this place. I don't agree with it, but I love it. And so to me, that's kind of the ideal, the archetype of the kind of Mormon I'd like to be. I mean, I'm a little bit more active than he is, but I really appreciate McMurrin's intellectual honesty, yet willingness to stay engaged.
Yeah, great.
And he's got books, or what? How do you, if someone wants to check him out, what would you recommend?
Well, you can find his articles in I think it's in Dialogue, and he has a very good book and very hard to find, The Theological Foundations of the Mormon Religion. And so he was a great philosopher in this stuff. And obviously I also
Signature Books did reprint that along with his Philosophical Foundation. So it's a 2-in-1 book that you can get from Signature Books.
Excellent. I also would add, and I think Dan would add as well, I think Eugene England and almost the entire corpus of people who wrote the 22 monographs that make up the book A Thoughtful Faith that was published 30 years ago, edited by Phil Barlow. I mean, so in that book, I can't recommend it enough. I tried to get it republished last year. It's still in process. Phil is trying to get it republished because it's been out of print for a while. But if you can get a copy of it, it has Richard Pohl's seminal talk about what the church means to people like me. It has Richard Bushman's original 1986 article. It has Eugene England. It has a lot of really great things, Emma Luthane and Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. I mean, there were great thinkers in the past that helped form, that said, hey, I know all this stuff. I know the church has bad history, but why do I stay? And I didn't hear apologetics. I'm an anti-apologist. Everybody knows that from me, that I really don't like Mormon apologetics. I don't think truth needs to be defended. I think that rigorous honesty is the right approach. And I did find in many of those writers a willingness to be rigorously honest. And I think that's what I appreciate the most about Sterling McMurrin.
Love it. Thanks, Mark. How about you, Jeralee?
Mark Crego and Dan Wotherspoon, and I'm supposed to get those books written, you guys. No, really.
I got one coming by the end of the year.
They have some good stuff to share. So I think both of them have books in the works, I'm hoping, and I bug them about it all the time. Non-LDS books that have been really important and valuable to me recently, Richard Rohr's Falling Upward, where he talks about the two halves of life.
Totally.
I find extremely valuable for wherever somebody lands. Fascinating read, something I recommend. And we talk about in ATF a lot. I think that's awesome. Also, I just finished Peter Enns' The Sin of Certainty. Fabulous, fabulous book. Dan did a podcast on it.
Did you buy it through my link?
I already had it. Sorry, Dan, but I am trying to support your Amazon link. Two really, really great books for anybody. I think wherever you are on the path, you know?
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah.
Sweet.
Thank you, Jeralee. How about you, Dan?
Well, just everyone remember, we're part, if you're in this sort of space that we're talking here, we're part of a huge intellectual tradition within Mormonism. Go back to B.H. Roberts, Widsoe, Talmage, Hugh B. Brown. Any of these people are just, fantastic models of people of deep faith, but massive intellects, and they were working to do it. And somehow or other, they found that secret to honor both the rational and the those sorts of things, but also the the stuff that's below what your rational mind can apprehend and stuff like that. And so there's just so many people like that you would do it, and so Mark mentioned through some of those people in a thoughtful faith, but Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, Claudia Bushman, I love Judy Dushku, then, of course, you go to Richard Bushman, you go to Armin Moss, Gene England, all those different ones. E. Erickson was a wonderful person that I've read quite a bit. Outside of it, if you're looking for contemporary people, I just say listen to Krista Tippett's podcast on being. It used to be called Speaking of Faith, and she will introduce you to so many people from other traditions that you will find an affinity to, because every one of them look at their tradition and say, man, it does many, many evil things, many, many bad things, but they haven't let that defeat them and say, leave it. And so that's where I've heard the phrase yes and, used in a different thing to sort of mean a both and. But for her, at least the way I read her book when she started talking about it, these people say, yes, I acknowledge all that bad stuff. And how do I go about, being part of this community and changing it? How do I go about, filling my calling in this life or within this tradition? So Krista will introduce you to lots of things, but then of course, if I go to literature, I've got to go to Chaim Potok and, all the stuff there. Cause if you go to the Hasidic community of Judaism and you see somebody breaking out in some way from their tradition, you can't help but see you, and then there's people that reject him, and then there's wise rabbis that accepted Asher Lev and some of the other protagonists. And so anyway, lots of
there might be a podcast or two worth mentioning.
I mean, as far as like meeting new people, new heroes and stuff,
or just resources to support people.
That when I came back from India, my first call, in fact, that Sunday that I went in church and I said, I can't do this anymore, I called you, John DeLynn, and we had a conversation back in 2011. And, and I asked you flat out, can you stay given this, the way things are? And we had a conversation. I'm not going to say what you said at the time, but you said it was very hard. And and I agree with you. It is very hard, but I think I have to acknowledge that you've been a tremendous influence in this community.
I was not looking for anything related to me. I was giving Dan a chance to plug his own podcast.
Oh, well, you will meet
Gina,
some fun
and
people
Gina.
on my podcast, I admit.
What?
Mormon Matters podcast and a Thoughtful Faith podcast. There it is.
Mark, I didn't mean to shut you up, but I don't want you to think I meant anything.
No. I recognize that, and Gina Colvin does a wonderful job too, and I think that she's got the banner for Thoughtful Faith as a podcast, and so, but one of the things that I really struggle with is the idea of hero worship, and I think that in Mormonism we're taught that no matter how good somebody is, they're always going to be fallible, and so to me. The most important hero that we have is the inner voice that lifts us up and takes us out of our crap and helps us and guides us on our path, a real living presence. And to me, that living presence is whom I've come to understand as being God. That's when I said there's a really low bar, because this guy sometimes misleads me. There's nobody that, that is going to not lead us astray at some point in time. But to me, the idea of a God that's within, that I can struggle with, that I can complain about, and who weeps with me and struggles with me, and is unconditionally loving. That to me is what makes the difference.
Love it.
Such an important point.
Mark Johnson recommends Sunstone. Can't argue with that. That's how I found
we're all
Dan.
speaking there. We're all speaking there.
Yeah, I found Dan through Sunstone, and that's where all the mischief began, right, Dan?
We've had a long and fruitful relationship.
Also, Charla recommends Brene Brown's Rising Strong.
Totally.
Yeah,
It's a
pretty
great
much
book.
any situation, Brene Brown's got some good support for it. Okay, so quick question. This is a bit speculation. Um, different people have different views. I guess many Orthodox Mormons see the church as a stone being cut out of the mountain without hands rolling forth to consume all nations. And then there's probably people on the other side who say the church is, its days are numbered and it's in decline. As you guys have been sort of, you could even say, conversing with the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, or at least a subset of them, do you guys have commentary on the overall health and vitality of the church, and if you have an optimistic or a less than optimistic view of the church's overall health and maybe even its future? Jeralee, I'll have you go first on this one. I know it's speculation, but what do you see on the front lines?
So it is speculation, and obviously some areas are growing. There was an article that I think you shared recently, John, about Utah Valley growing with members of the church, but Salt Lake City shrinking, right? Do I have that right?
That's right.
So we're from Northern California, and from the area that we moved here from, I see shrinking happening there. And I'm not sure that as far as missions that we're really growing. It seems like I'm seeing a little shrinking there. So my speculation would be that it's maybe not growing.
All right. Mark, you're next on the speculation mobile.
Oh, I think that the empirical evidence is, other than biological growth, the church is not growing in activity, and it's not growing in vibrancy here in North America, and in Europe it hasn't been growing for decades. So I think that it's correct that if we look at it from a point of view of growth, it's got issues. If we look at it from a point of view of health, I think the church is what I would call a narcissistic or institution. In other words, it has a sense that it is entitled to something, and it has no ability to have empathy for anyone outside of the fold of Mormonism. And I say that as an institution because institutions can be narcissistic as well as individuals. And I think that until our church comes to the realization that we have in our doctrine a universal sense that everyone is a child of God, not just Mormons, and realize that at best we can be a positive contributing force for those who choose to be Mormons to help repair the world and do positive things. There's so much good in Mormonism. The community, the home teaching, the ability to serve, to be called to something. This is really positive. And the church is never going to disappear because that positive is pervasive. For those who find in the church something positive, it really is important to them. So it's not going to go away, but it really, really is missing an opportunity to be meaningful in the lives of people if we can reach out. And instead of saying, I'm going to objectify my neighbors, I live in the mission field, I'm going to objectify my neighbors and find which ones I'm going to convert to the gospel, that never works. But if my role as a Mormon is to be a friend to people and to realize that if they choose to be Catholic, Muslim, Hindu, then we all ought to share in that. And I ought to be in the position, you choose to be Catholic, let's share the fact that we can both share faith, that which is in common, and become better Catholics and better Mormons individually, and without the pretense of converting somebody else. And when the church realizes that that's the way to share love, it'll come back to healthiness. It has to learn empathy. And it's not, I don't think it's the leaders. I think it's the culture and the institution that has created that narcissism, and we have to fix it.
All right, Dan.
I'll be really short. It's not very healthy right now, but we're making it healthier. The conversations like this, the online blogosphere, everything is making it healthier. it's at an inflection point. I really think it's going to go one way or the other. And I think ultimately pragmatism will win out, and they'll say that, to bless the world, we're going to have to rethink these things that we thought were set in stone. I know that the brethren themselves know that revelation isn't quite as simple as they want to, or that so many people want it to believe. And so as they learn that vulnerability and sharing and openness on their part about the process of revelation and how it's not clear, and that, we have to wrestle together, and it's through counseling with each other and through divergence opinions that finally something can emerge. And that when those processes aren't followed, we get bad policies and things like that. But as soon as they're able to say that I can trust Latter-day Saints to get a peek behind the curtain a little bit more, it's going to get healthier. So the more that we share our stories and the various things out here, we're making it more healthy. And with everybody else, it won't go away, but we're fighting for its very, the tenor of the next, quarter century or something right now. And I think we're serving it well.
Dan, what would you say to someone who responded to Mark's comment by saying, actually, if we look at how Protestant Christianity has liberalized itself, they've actually gotten weaker. The best thing the church can do is remain orthodox, and that keeps it vital. What would you say to someone who said Mark's got it wrong? Liberalization is only going to weaken the church.
Well, I'm not calling for liberalization. I'm calling for deep spirituality. I'm calling for people to know who God is for themselves, and not mediated through somebody else, and not mediated through teachings. And this is a set of belief, and therefore I'm on a good spiritual path. Man, it's like, I'm not calling for any liberalization or anything like that. I'm calling for people that really know what the voice of God sounds like in their own lives.
Nice answer. Nice.
Okay, so for all of you, are there changes that you've seen in the church or even culture that have encouraged or excited you since A Thoughtful Faith began? Let's start with Jeralee.
That's a tough question. Changes in the culture. Okay, the first thing that comes to my mind is when Elder Christofferson spoke out at a press conference and said, yes, you can differ with the brethren. I think that was big for a lot of people in our group. I don't know that everybody feels that that really is the case in every ward or every stake, but it gives us something to point to, because it is very divisive. And I have a family member that serves in a high leadership calling, we'll just say, and I know that it's something that he honors, the fact that Elder Christofferson said that, and allows for room for people to be able to express and feel differently, hopefully without fear. I have friends who have experienced the difficulty of having a temple recommend removed and then given back to them because that was something they were able to point to, and even write letters to the brethren and say, this is what Elder Christofferson said, and I have just verbalized that to my leaders anyway, and then temple recommend was renewed. So that's just something that's a little hopeful to me. I do see signs of little hopeful things here and there, and I guess the best analogy is that it takes a long time to move a big ship, and that's what that's kind of what we're up against, is that we all have our list of things that we'd like to see changed in the church, but it's a very slow moving process. But there are signs of hope here and there, I think.
Sure. Thanks, Jeralee. How about you, Mark?
I guess I'm a little bit more guarded, because I think that when I have seen hope, then the next week I get disappointment. It is tough to rely upon the roller coaster of the institution, and particularly the part that really hurts me the most is when I see ecclesiastical abuse. And I see this manipulation of dear beloved people within A Thoughtful Faith and in transitions and everywhere, where they're being held hostage because of a ecclesiastical leader's position. I think that's very, very tough. I think that's really harmful, and I don't see that changing yet. I see a lot of empathetic leaders arising, and maybe that gives me hope. But for everyone that I see arise, I still see 2 or 3 that are withholding temple recommends and not allowing people to express their real lived experience. It's a tough time. And so for me, the survival strategy is to not have any expectations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that I learned from Hinduism, is the idea that, you know, you need to detach your emotion from outcomes. You know, our job is to do our work, and our work is the saving of souls, our own and others. And the only place that I can do that is in my ward, and that's all I really care about at this point in time, and among my friends. And you know, the church, it's out there, okay? It's there, and at some point in time, you know, General Conference is a painful process for all of us. We listen to that; it's painful. Then we get that one talk, usually by Dieter Uchtdorf, maybe an occasional one by Elder Holland. You know, and that gives us hope. And I'm thinking of the roller coaster and the manipulation that we're doing to ourselves. Why? Come back to the idea that if I don't have expectations, I'm not going to be disappointed. And you know, I really love President Uchtdorf's talks. I think they're absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't make my life depend upon that roller coaster. I have to find my own spirituality, and I have to live my own Mormonism by the way that I think it's important to me. So hope is not something that I'm going to have in an institution or in a person. It's just not going to work that way.
So important.
Sounds healthy.
Yeah, beautiful. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, my hope is just the more Mormons I meet, the more I sense that we're going to be fine. You know, we have a great ward, lots of older folks and lots of young couples. And I'll tell you, these young couples that come in are sharp and they're thoughtful and things like that. So the ones that have stayed they're gonna influence the church, and they influence our ward already, and we just have a great experience. So that's my hope, is just the more that we get to know people, they get to know us, it's gonna work out. Now with Mark, again, I want to, you know, when you say something like our job is to save souls, I don't want anybody to think that for me that means the Mormon temple ordinances, or, you know, even you have to be Christian or anything like that. And I think Mark would agree with me that the larger thing is for people to understand their own divinity, their own worth, their own, you know, infinite power and things like that. So for me, a saving of a soul is more along the lines of awakening to who you truly are. You know, that veil of forgetfulness is partly, you know, you forgot who you were, you forgot how important you were, you forgot how spiritual you were there. And so all the things of life get in there. And so I see in Mormonism more and more people just concentrating on that. And that makes me happy. And I'm hearing a lot less of the one and only true church, and I'm hearing a lot less of things like that. That's all about the institution, and you know, you certainly get the stay on the good ship Zion and those kinds of comments there, and safety and stuff. But I think more and more people, as they live in the world, they're ready for adventure, and at least the ones I meet seem to respond well to me. Maybe they go home and say, that Wotherspoon boy was really crazy, but you know, I guess he's okay because he helped with the ward cleanup the other day. But.
Thank you, Dan. I totally agree with what you said about saving souls. I don't mean saving souls is doing the traditional thing, but rather, you know, when I say that if I have found, you know, God within me, I know that God is within every other person.
Right.
And my job is to have my God connect with their God, and my person connect with their person. And that to me is what saves souls. It's a here and now thing. It's this moment. Have we been able to connect in love, and have we been able to become better people by this interaction?
Yeah.
Love it. Well, you are three lovely, delightful, wise, committed people. And
talkative.
What's that?
Talkative.
Ramblers.
Ramblers.
Dan, you've been the most brief of all three today. I'm going to give you the concise brevity award, but I wouldn't take a word away from any three of you. So I guess I want to end by asking you guys to each sort of give a closing statement. You know, one way to answer the question would be what keeps you going, or what gives you hope, or if you just want to share words of encouragement for people who are trying to walk this path, or even are have left it or, are critical of it, or any of those, what sort of parting wisdom or perspective or hope or message would you like to share? And we'll do Mark, then Dan, then Jeralee.
Yeah, that's a really important question, and I think the best thing that I can say, well, just this last week, my granddaughter went to the hospital. She collapsed. She's a very small child. She has dwarfism, but she completely collapsed from cerebellar ataxia. It's something pretty serious ailment. And she went to the hospital, and we were all very concerned. And over the weekend, as I went there, my son-in-law was caring for. He and my daughter are believers, and they're faithful in the church, and nuanced, of course. But at the same time, I asked if he had given his daughter a blessing, and of course he had. His father died a year ago, and for whatever reason, I asked him, "Do you want a blessing?" And he said he did. And, I really don't know why, but I think the more important part is I needed to minister to him. As his father had passed away, I was his only father. And there was a very special moment, where I summoned whatever spiritual God that is within me to communicate whatever I could with him. And that kind of sweetness and that kind of tenderness, and recognizing that in the earlier days until about 60 years ago, women did the same thing. So I think there's hope when we look at the ability that we have. The real priesthood that we have is available to anybody who is willing to bless another human being at a moment of need. And that, to me, is what keeps me going. The idea that we really have something that we can share with each other and serve each other and love each other and bless each other and become gods to each other by answering prayers.
Beautiful.
Beautiful.
Wow, dude.
Thanks, Mark.
That's awesome. I'll just say, hey, everybody, you're on a good journey. Any journey is a good journey. Just keep after it. Keep going for it. I'll just say, I've probably shared it a couple of times, at least in my podcast, but I'll share it more often in one-on-one situations. There's a great metaphor that I gained from Rick Jepson, who wrote in Sunstone an article called God Wrestling that we did. It was about Jacob and the angel and all that stuff. But as he talked about wrestling, and so whether you're wrestling with God, whether you're wrestling with the church, whether you're wrestling with a spouse, whatever it would be, just remember that in a wrestling hold, even though you're fighting, you're also embracing. And if you can kind of have that both and, of it. Why am I fighting with this? Because I care about it. Why am I fighting it? Because I sense that something's real is at stake, in my life or something, whether it's, the eternities or all that stuff. You don't need to go to there, but just, I've got to make peace with my church, if nothing else. And so the more that we can fight in the spirit of also hugging at the same time, I encourage that. So I'll just leave that for my final today. Thanks.
Love it. Good memories of Sunstone past. Jeralee, bring us home.
These guys are awesome, aren't they? I just wanted to make the point. First, let me say something to John or about John to everyone in my closing thoughts. And I'll start sharing with a little experience. Sometime within the last year, I posted something on Facebook and John clicked like or maybe love on it. And immediately one of my friends in a comment said, "Beware of John DeLynn. He's pulling people away from the church." And I immediately removed the comment and messaged that friend personally and said, I have some of my own family members who have left the church, and what people's status are, whether they're in or out of the church, doesn't determine whether I value them as a friend or not. So for anybody who in my circle of friends or family who might be listening to this, I want you to know that that's the way I view this, and that I really want to be a part of the bridge building. And here's a little shout out to a member of ATF and friend John Ogden, who's written a really awesome book called When Mormons Doubt, which I could have mentioned earlier and forgot.
Yeah.
And I really see that as a bridge building book, how we can, no matter where we are in our belief, or how we see things, we can learn to focus on the things that we do have in common. And rather than focusing on the things where we differ, because, you know, we're going to get a lot further if John DeLynn and Mark Crego and Dan Wotherspoon and Jeralee can work together to build bridges and create safe spaces for people than if we just try to close people off. And so I thought it was important to mention that. I think a lot of times people come to us in ATF in what they would call a faith crisis. And for many people, it really is a very painful, difficult, tender experience. I don't know that I would describe what's happened to me in my journey as a crisis. So I stick with the faith journey, which I know Dan uses a lot too. There have been some very painful and difficult moments and points and feelings of emotions, but I wouldn't describe it as a crisis. But I think however we're experiencing it and however we are describing it, I think it's a cycle, or can be a cycle, of spiritual growth. And in looking to nature, the ground breaks before a plant can come out and bloom. And so if we think of it as breaking before we bloom and making room for new life and new faith, then I think it really puts a more constructive name on what we're all about and what we're trying to do. And I would just say that wherever people land, I think life is long, and we don't have to decide today. If you can give yourself time to work through these things, time will work for you. But no matter where you land, life is beautiful and life is valuable. And I think learning to be mindful and live in the moment and appreciate the relationships and the people that we have around us today is really, really important. And I would just end by saying I am far from what I once was and not yet what I'm going to be.
So
Love it.
nice.
Thank you, John and Margie.
Oh,
Time. I know a lot of people in ATF feel like their voices don't get represented a lot. And so I think that's why all of us felt that this would be an important thing to do. So we appreciate that.
Yes.
we're so
Thank you very much.
grateful. We're so grateful. Thank you for coming on. Honestly, we honor you. We're grateful for you. Really. Thank you
Namaste.
for all you do.
Agreed. And yeah, the Facebook group is A Thoughtful Faith. Not all need to apply. This is a very selective group, only for people who are seeking to constructively remain engaged with Mormonism. It's not the place to be super negative or critical. It's not the place to rage against the church or to sow seeds of doubt. It's a place to build and edify each other and to communicate in ways that support people who are working to find constructive healing spiritual paths within Mormonism. So check it out if you meet that criteria. And we just want to thank Jeralee and Mark and Dan and everyone who helps moderate. I know there's a whole team of moderators that we haven't mentioned. What's that?
No, fantastic team. Yeah, there's 7 or 8 of us now, and
Amazing.
everybody works hard. Jeralee the hardest by far, but Mark next.
You know, I just want to say this group's really important to me too. I don't have it all figured out, and I'm very comfortable in saying that I'm still very much in the wrestle, and so I do what I do because this group is valuable to me, and these people are valuable to me.
Yeah, and you can share your doubt, you can share your pain on it. It's just don't preach as I've now doubted it so much that it is the truth and all you people are benighted, you know, that kind of thing. So there's still plenty of wrestle that is shown.
A few final reminders. Don't forget the Mormon Matters retreat with Natasha Elfer Parker, Dan Wotherspoon, and Marty Erickson,
Right.
July 14th through 16th. Go to mormonmatters.org to register. Check out Mormon Matters podcast. Please donate to it.
Yes.
Support Dan Wotherspoon at mormonmatters.org. Support Gina Colvin at athoughtfulfaith.org. Anyone who supports the Open Stories Foundation supports this mission of people impacted by faith transitions. And whether they are trying to stay in the church or leaving the church or navigate a mixed faith marriage. The Open Stories Foundation's here for you. And so please support us. If you enjoy these episodes and you don't contribute, please consider going right now to one of these podcasts, signing up for $10 a month, $25 a month, $50 a month, $100 a month, whatever you can do. We do our best to always use your funds to support the mission of the organization, to support Dan, Gina, Natasha, others. And contributions matter. We're transparent in our finances. We always have been. We always will be. And we need your support to keep this going. So please don't be a freeloader. Please support the programs that you benefit from. Is that too rude? Was that a little rude?
A little.
Sorry. Support us. Want to thank the panels today. Want to thank Cody Layton and Amy Grubbs. We couldn't do it without you guys, the whole Open Stories Foundation board. I want to thank my brilliant wife, Margie.
Thanks. Back to you, babe.
Thanks
Really,
for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks to all the listeners who joined us live and the viewers to give comments and questions.
Yeah.
That makes this more interactive and fun. So thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Please join us again soon. And of course, thanks to everyone who listens to us asynchronously, either on YouTube or just by downloading the MP3. You guys matter too. The conversation continues at mormonstories.org, on the blog, or on YouTube or on Facebook. We would love to hear from you. So please tune in again for another Mormon Stories episode soon. Love you guys.
Thank you, everyone.
And thanks
Love you
again.
all.
Panelists.
Goodbye. Thanks for listening.
Take care, everybody.
Cheers.